Hello and welcome everybody to our podcast under the banner All In, and normally we do lots of film retrospectives, but on this particular episode we are covering none other than the Nintendo Switch. I've titled this All About the Switch, just thought that would work out quite well. And I'm your host John Scott, joined as always by my co-host on just about anything that we cover here on these podcasts, Matt Essex. Matt, how you doing? And welcome along to this Nintendo special.
Yeah, no, of course, great to be here. Are you getting sick of actually me being interested in so much the same stuff as you? Yeah.
I'm getting worried. You know, like the idea of cloning. Like, have they already cloned personality characteristics? How has this happened? But yeah, it's cool. You know, often myself and Matt, if you're coming across this podcast, and you know, you might not have heard any of our other stuff, but we do have a wrestling podcast out there under WrestleLine, and yeah, we do a lot on that. But also we have quite similar interests in maybe the same sort of films. And now we're onto games. We're finally in this, but we're touching down on the Nintendo Switch. And the reason I thought it'd be really good to get Matt on is in particular is because Matt does not own well, actually he does own, but he hasn't got it in front of him yet because he's ordered himself a Nintendo Switch. But myself, I am the Nintendo geek between the two of us. I'm the fanboy, I guess. Between the two of us, and I thought it'd be really good to get Matt's point of view from the outsider, somebody who's really into games but maybe not so much on the Nintendo front, and yeah, just to try and kind of fill those gaps in. And I think it'll kind of come across well if you're somebody that's maybe interested or like just wondering what sort of fuss is about, and you know, you might have seen the commercials now and then, or never really thought about buying a Nintendo console because let's face it, for the last, I don't know, maybe 8-9 years, Nintendo's really been out of the game of full-on consoles that can compete with the likes of the PlayStation and the Xbox. So, Matt, first of all, you know, I'm going to throw it out there. Have you ever owned a Nintendo console? I don't know if I've asked you that before, but...
Yeah, of course I have. I mean, I think everyone had a Wii in their house at some point, surely. Mm-hmm. I mean, that sounds a bit wrong, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to be careful how we word that one. Especially for those that are not into gaming. But yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, the Wii, I believe it holds some like amazing statistic on per unit sold. Like it was literally more out there, believe it or not, than a PlayStation and Xbox at one time, just purely because it had that kind of family dynamic about it. You know, like the fact that Nintendo had to kind of go another direction to you know, compete with the likes of Sony and Microsoft. So in this episode, literally, I'm gonna go back a little bit. I'm gonna give you a little bit of history on Nintendo, just because it sets up what we're about to talk about with the Switch, and I think it kind of shows the evolution of how we got to this point. And by the way we did get to this point is kind of very, very somewhat awkward, I guess, because of how it all came about, just in terms of like the financing and how the financing came about and all that stuff. So yeah, we're going to be touching base on all that and obviously a lot more. So what I'm basically going to do now is just give you guys a little bit of heads up on the other stuff that we're going to be talking about. We're going to go into great detail on what the Switch literally contains, in terms of what it has, what the ability is, and what's obviously going to come soon. And I'm going to talk to you guys briefly about some of the games that I've been playing that have been out there, because you know, I've had time to play a few games full on. So yeah, I'm sure hopefully you'll get something out of this podcast. So yeah, let's literally go back, shall we? Because I want to take us back to a time where Nintendo, or in fact, let's go way back here. that Nintendo literally came on the scene was, and it's worth pointing out that Atari, back in the day, I'm sure you know this as well, Matt, if you've watched any sort of like documentaries back in the past, but literally Atari kind of destroyed itself by literally getting way too cocky with itself, and customers and consumers just gave up on the product of a gaming machine at home, because literally there were games coming out like I think everybody knows this one, Matt, if you've ever heard the famous story about E.T. That is gotta be one of the most dreadfulest games ever put out. But yeah, there's like this massive story. You can probably get this stuff on YouTube, where literally they completely destroyed themselves, and yeah, customers just gave up. Like, they were expecting this really good ET game. The film was big, and let's get the game. And there was loads of stuff like that. You'd get this wonderful cover, and then you'd throw in the game and be like, what the hell have I just bought? This is unbelievably terrible. And yeah, basically what happened, unfortunately, in Atari's situation, is they let everybody make games for that machine, and you just couldn't do a quality like sort of control. So Atari kind of destroyed itself, and literally for a few years gaming just wasn't on the horizon. There were things, of course, that came out. Matt, have you ever heard of the Commodore 64?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah, I heard of that one. Is that one that used to run on the cassettes, was it?
Yes, it did used to. It had cartridge as well, but it was it looked like a keyboard, basically. I was given one of these beautiful machineries back in the day, and I remember like the whole commercials with it was they tried to get around it by going, this is educational as well as a gaming console. And I was like, and trust me, when you try to get on that thing, it didn't even, like, there's no way you could have done any homework on it. I don't think it had any way of connecting to a printer, and it was like, it didn't even have like the most simplest of like a word pad. Like, literally it was awful. Like, you could write, but it wouldn't space things, or it was terrible. So the fact that they sold it on that commercial was like, this is an educational piece of equipment. Your kids aren't just going to be staring at the screen playing games. They're going to be doing some written work. But yeah, that was not to be. But yeah, how amazing is that, Matt? Like, just to think about that, the whole fact that they were running off cassettes.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's hard to think how that technology even works these days. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there now that don't even know what a cassette is, perhaps.
No, that's true. In fact, only this past Christmas, on the holidays, I literally received a what looked like a cassette, but actually it's a battery charger. And they've literally just made it look like that. So that's the only time I've seen one recently. Is that from that came out of my present. But yeah, so literally we had this time where there was nothing about, and then all of a sudden, this big toy company from Japan, they come on the scene. They get into America, but the problem is they cannot. For the life of them, they cannot get into the stores, and people have given up. So like, all the shops are like, no, we don't want one of those games consoles. Nobody's buying them. So Nintendo really did a very good job as selling it as a toy. That this isn't just a games console, it is a toy. So they threw in this gun, and they threw in this little robot, I can't remember his name, but they tried to sell it as toys. And the whole thing, Duck Hunt, I'm sure everybody's familiar with that if you're an old school fan. Duck Hunt, come with a gun. It wasn't anything like amazing, but at that time there wasn't too many things like that. And I think if you look at where we ended up with the Wii, you can already see back then that they had those innovations were going on for Nintendo, that they always wanted to try and throw something else in there with those things. And of course, what Nintendo done very, very smartly, there's a very famous story about it. In fact, I'm just looking up on Wiki to see if they'd put it on their page, which they had. Basically, what they did here is they got hold of the Teddy Ruxpin. Do you ever remember that, Matt? I don't know, it might have been way before your time. Yeah. It's basically like this talking bear thing, basically. And it was literally like, it was the hottest thing in that year for Christmas. So what Nintendo done was they rung that company up and said, look, can we pay you X amount of dollars to have wherever your Teddy Ruxpin gets sold, our Nintendos go with it. The deal was made, and literally that is how Nintendo got into all these stores in the toy section. And I guess, I don't want to go too much into this because we're talking about the Switch, but as they say, the rest is history. Nintendo was born, and the Nintendo, of course, the Nintendo Entertainment System was around us. Everybody's probably seen in the last few years they've re-released this thing as well as a mini version, and it's still very, very popular. The demand of it is still there very much. I think it's like sold out and nobody could get them, and to get one now, only the price has gone up even more. So it's like, the value of that machine is just like priceless, basically. And yeah, they came on the scene, and again, they dropped a game, like Mario Brothers and Zelda back then, and those two titles alone pretty much made that a household name. I think I remember the thing when I was very young playing Mario for the first time. It was like one of the first games that I remember playing that actually had like like layers to it. Like you could go back and then find like secret things, and like you could run up on the bar where the score was and stuff like that, and get through to like, I don't know, level 4 instead of playing through. And it's the fact that there are all these little hidden gems. Like you didn't really see that much back in the day with games, and it just sort of blew my mind that you could play this so many different ways, and you were trying to look for secrets all the time. Again, with Zelda come along, the amazing thing about that is the fact you could complete the game, but in any order that you wanted to. I know that sounds pretty terrible compared to where we are today, but back then, trust me, everything was pretty much platformy. And if it wasn't, it kind of looked terrible. But like when Zelda come along, it had a really good adventure story, plus the fact that it gave you power to kind of just complete things in the way you wanted. And again, moving on to that, we then get to the Super Nintendo, and again, massive hit. Matt, did you ever have or see or know anybody who had these consoles?
Oh yeah, our mutual friend, who we've known for a long time, he has been like a Nintendo guy throughout his youth. It was like his go-to console, right away from the NES through to the N64, and then sort of a few more options became available. But obviously, because as I was a close childhood friend of his, that was kind of personally, at a young age, I was like given a Sega console. I mean, I didn't have a choice. I was just given it. So that's what I grew up on. But it was good to have the option and go over and play these Nintendo games as well, because, like you said, they were so vastly different from anything that Sega was putting out there.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. I mean, I suppose it's worth pointing out is back then, things like consoles, a lot of the games were exclusive only to the console. So it's like if you had a Nintendo, you might be playing only a certain types of games, whereas if you have a Sega, they're a little bit more edgy, and you might be playing completely different games to what you would on the other. So it was always like you kind of was made to pick almost, and if anything, you kind of needed both to kind of just have everything on your doorstep. But so literally the SNES was out. Again, I own this as well, and things like Donkey Kong Country was out on it. I mean, the strange thing with Donkey Kong is if you go back and look at it graphically, you're like, hang on a minute, that looked better than some of the Sega Saturn games. It's very odd how they managed to do that, considering like what it was. It was a 32-bit, it wasn't exactly a lot on it. Now, Nintendo waited around for quite a while before they would release their next console, which of course, as Matt alluded to, there was the N64. Again, another one I had. The only one thing I didn't enjoy about that was that damn controller. I was not a massive fan of that huge, chunky, great bloody thing. But lots of fun with that. And again, what Nintendo were able to do so well was just drop these few titles, and bang, that just literally sold everything out. And there was this war between Sega and Nintendo for many, many years, but I think in the end, no matter what, the thing with Sega is they always needed to, and I've seen like a few interviews, and their issue is that Nintendo made mascot